Hello, how you doing? I hope you guys are doing well. It's a beautiful morning outside. The sun is out, and our little pet deer is out there again. That has nothing to do with my lesson, but I thought I'd throw that out there. I'm kind of in a good mood. We are going to look at the founding period, which generally is between 1789 and 1837. Now, notice I said the word generally because some of these themes are going to go a little bit past or actually go back a little bit before that time period, but this is the heart of the founding period in U.S. history. And the reason these years are chosen is it's the years from our first president becoming president, George Washington, till Andrew Jackson leaves office March 4th, 1837. Quick note about this. This is not an all history lesson. This is a brief overview. And so I'm going to be going through a lot of these things very quickly. You should have learned these things in fourth and fifth grade. I'm not saying you did, but you should have. This is just an update, so to speak, to kind of bring a refresher to bring this information back to your mind from what you should have learned the last couple years. So let's get right to it. This time period sees 7 presidents. George Washington, obviously, is our first president. John Adams is our second. Thomas Jefferson is our third president. And I am his 7th great grandnephew. That's pretty cool. James Madison is the 4th president. James Monroe is the 5th. Our 6th president is John Quincy Adams, and a little note about how he became president later on. And then Andrew Jackson. And really, Andrew Jackson brings the end to this era quite abruptly. The first 6 presidents listed there are of the social elite. They were amongst our founding fathers, or at least the son of a founding father. They had their revolutionary roots. Andrew Jackson would be a president of the Western frontier. He would be from Tennessee, and he would represent an abrupt change in American history. Some people have likened him to either Donald Trump or Teddy Roosevelt, depending on your point of view. But he was definitely one of those lightning rod kind of presidents. And some people view Andrew Jackson as one of the best presidents in U.S. history, and some people view Andrew Jackson as one of the worst presidents in U.S. history. It really depends on your point of view. But there is one thing that is without a doubt. Depending on your point of view, you're going to see him as one of the greatest or one of the worst. It's not just like somewhere in the middle. All right, there are 10 major themes during this period that I want to bring out. Establishing stability for our new country. Our country had to establish itself. It's a new country in a world that all the other countries have a very different kind of government when our country starts. Political parties. We're going to go through the first party system and then the second party system. And we are actually part of the third party system here. We'll get into that later. We're going to have a change in the electorate. When our country first started, yes, it was a democratic republic, but most people didn't get to vote. In fact, most white men even didn't get to vote. You're going to see a gradual change in this country from 1789 up until today, where certain groups of citizens will be allowed to vote. The first group of citizens that wasn't allowed to vote is going to change, is going to happen during this time period. I don't want to give too much away yet. Expansion to the west. Our nation is going to move westward. In 1776, the western border of the United States was the Ohio River. Think about that. Native American conflict. Slavery is a major issue during this time period that will only ramp up later. Economic issues. We're talking about a time period where there's a lot of depressions. Sectionalism, that means the North and the South and the Southwest and the Northwest. And by the way, the Northwest is not the Northwest of today. The Northwest is basically what is today Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota. That's the Northwest. And industrialization. When our country first founded, there weren't factories in the United States. Now, that's hard to envision. But soon after our country becomes a country, it's going to become industrialized. And we're going to talk about what industrialization means as well. Again, though, this is a brief overview, so I'm going to go rather quickly. One of the first things about our country is we had to establish ourselves as a legitimate country. Again, it was not a given that our noble experiment of a democratic republic would even work. Frankly, it hadn't worked since the Roman Empire. And that was almost 1,500 years by this point. So in a world full of strong, empiric means empire-like, monarchical, that means king and queen nations, the young new United States was the exception. And most of the world was waiting for us to fall apart, and they were looking for their opportunity to take advantage when that happened. So from our beginning, we would have to fight to maintain and justify our existence. From almost wars to all-out declared wars, the United States sovereign rights were tested early on. When I say sovereign rights, what do I mean? Sovereignty is the authority of a state to govern itself. We started as colonies, then we became an independent country, and there were countries that looked to us and wanted to basically reconquer us and make us colonies again. It didn't happen, but the worry of it happening was a legitimate worry. It was something that countries like France and England and even the Netherlands, they were looking for us to fall apart and looking to step into the void. Now, what are some examples? Well, first off, we had to change our kind of government. When our country became a country, we had a government called the Articles of Confederation. Simply put, there were problems with the Articles of Confederation. It was too weak. The 13 states could argue and bicker amongst each other. If a state didn't want to do what the National Continental Congress agreed to do, they just didn't do it. And Rhode Island did that all the time. I mean, literally all the time. Rhode Island was like, I'm not doing it, all the time. Whether it came to taxes or sending help for troops, or you can just, anything you can imagine. States were literally putting taxes on each other. And this was a major problem. And that's why we established the U.S. Constitution. And what it did was it created a stronger national government for protection from outside and internal forces. We had to fight the Northwest Indian War. Now, on the surface, you're like, wait a minute, you're fighting Native Americans and here at home. What's that have to do with other countries trying to take over? Well, Britain had lost the Revolutionary War, but they didn't really give up on trying to get us back. It's not until after the War of 1812 that they finally just give up on that proposition. And here's one example. The weapons that the Native Americans had to fight in the Northwest Territory against settlers coming in, they were given to them by the British. Yes, the British were trying a different tactic. Rather than fight us directly, they were trying to get Native Americans and white settlers to fight each other and create a weakness, and then eventually be able to come into the power void and take over themselves. Another example is the Quasi War with France. Without getting too technical, quasi kind of means sort of. Okay? It's a sort of war. It's not a declared war. Congress has to declare war. But France and the United States navies are fighting each other. American troops, American sailors are being impressed by both the French and the British during this time period. And so it's a difficult time period. Also, you have what's known as the Barbary Wars with a nation called Tripoli. Tripoli is basically Mauritania today. So if you look at a map, northwest Africa, just south of Spain is the nation of Mauritania. That was called Tripoli at the time. And our merchant ships were constantly fighting the Barbers. Basically, it was a piracy kind of war. There was more to it than a piracy war, but long story short, it was a challenge to America's new independence. Are we going to be strong enough to defend ourselves from stuff like that? And then obviously the War of 1812. And if you remember from 4th or 5th grade, when we were fighting the War of 1812, we were fighting the British again. And in a very real sense, if we lose that war, we become British colonies again. It was definitely a statement war. And the United States not losing that war allowed us to maintain sovereignty and showed the world that we were at least a regional power. We weren't a superpower yet, but we were a regional power here in the Americas that was going to be able to stand the test of time. Secondly, in the early part of this period, from the 1790s through the 1800s and the 1810s, you begin to have the first political party system happen in world history. And the two major political parties were known as Federalist and Democratic Republicans. Your Federalists were led by Alexander Hamilton and John Adams. If you go and watch the musical Hamilton, that's definitely from a Federalist point of view. They favored a strong national government to be over top state governments or sovereign over the state governments. They wanted suffrage for landowners only. Suffrage is the right to vote. They favored a national bank and Hamilton's vision of the economic sector. They wanted to favor urban jobs, the bringing in of industrialization, factories, those kind of things. They wanted an emphasis on manufacturing, shipping, and trade. They favored protective tariffs. So in other words, a high tax on goods coming into the country and no taxes on goods leaving our country. And in international affairs, they favored Britain over France in foreign relations. Now remember, this is just after we gained our independence from the British. And even though he was not technically a Federalist, George Washington, at least on this bottom line, actually did favor the British over the French, even though the French helped us win the American Revolution. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ledger, you had the Democratic Republicans of James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. They wanted a government with strong state governments led by the common man. Now, what they called the common man was the highly educated yeoman farmer, somebody who was growing crops and also growing some cash crops independently without slave labor. Even though Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner, in his long-term vision, one of the things was that the yeoman farmer would obliterate or end slavery. He is quoted as saying, "Cultivators are the most valuable people on earth." And cultivators are farmers. They are cultivating crops. They're cultivating livestock. He opposed a national bank. They believed in open trade, so they wanted low tariffs. And they favored the French over the British in foreign relations. And so this is going to be a major difference. I will throw this out there. It is not required for my class, but some people are just interested in learning more about this time period. And if you are, there is a book called Founding Brothers by Joseph Ellis. It's honestly really good if you ever want to read it. But again, it's long, and I'm not going to make you do it for this class or anything like that. It's just that if you like to read historical books, it's a great book. I would strongly advise it. All right, suffrage rights is going to be a major issue. Basically, who gets to vote? Do all citizens get to vote? Or what are the requirements to be allowed to vote? Even today, if you think about it, you kids are not allowed to vote, and you're citizens of the United States. So throughout our history, we've had certain people who could vote and certain people who could not. At the beginning of our country, most people could not vote. And the reason is, if you wanted to vote, first off, you had to be white. Secondly, you had to be a male. And third, you had to own a certain amount of property. Now, that has a certain amount. Notice it's kind of a vague amount, depending on what time between 1789 and 1837 we're talking about. It also depended on the state, because each state determined that. Simply put, not everybody, not even every white male got the vote. You had to own a lot of property. So only rich people got the vote at the beginning. Now, the first suffrage movement that's going to happen is this change where at least all white male citizens will get the vote. And by the end of this period, in most states, all white male citizens over 21 would get the vote. Now, today, we look at that and say, that's awful. But believe it or not, that was a movement. That was a major change from 1776 to 1837. And you're going to see that expansion of voting rights continue right up until today. So it's even a major issue today if you're paying attention in the news. We'll get to that later as the year progresses, but that's one of the themes that's going to continue to grow here. Now, the impact on presidential elections. If you look at our first 6 presidents, they're elite, white, rich, large landowning, Eastern presidents. They're all right along the East Coast. They're very wealthy, and they are very famous for their contributions in the American Revolution. Now, gradually throughout the period, the electorate is going to change, and by the seventh president, Andrew Jackson, you're going to have a Western president, or at least at that time, Tennessee was the West. You're going to have a president that is more along the lines of the common man. He's going to be a war hero, not of the Revolutionary War era, but of the War of 1812. And he's going to be kind of a rough and tumble kind of guy. He's a different character altogether. So that's and the reason a guy like Andrew Jackson could become president is because the voting rights of people changed, especially in these western states. You know, new states that came along allowed all white male citizens to vote, and that even meant poor white citizens and uneducated white citizens. And they view the world a little bit differently than the rich elite landowners and, you know, property owners of the East Coast. So you're going to see a definite change happen. Andrew Jackson represents the beginning of the second party system. And so this second party system, you're going to no longer have the Federalist and Democratic Republicans. Instead, the Democratic Republicans are going to keep the name Democratic Republicans and just turn into the Democratic Party. They're going to favor tradition. They're going to be opposed to national banks. They're going to oppose state legislative reform. They believe that national overlook. They believed in freedom of choice. They believed in rural independence. So small communities in the rural countryside of the West are going to have their independence. They're going to be very strong in being pro-slavery. They believe in rapid territorial expansion, and they're going to want the West to become slave states. And that's going to be a major issue that's going to start to really become prevalent. They want rapid territorial expansion for the expansion of slavery and the expansion of plantations and king cotton, which we're going to talk about later. They were favored in the South especially. Meanwhile, the Northeast, you're going to have the Whig Party. Now, the Whig Party favored modernization. They didn't want the traditional farming, plantation system. They wanted an industrial system. Their idea was to look to the future. Look what the world is going to be like in 20, 25 years. Hey, we need to build railroads. Hey, we need to, promote economic growth, and government needs to do that. And government could do that by, for example, creating tax breaks for new innovations. The Whigs advocated reforms, for example, to the slave system. They favored industry and urban growth. They wanted a gradual territorial expansion west. And the Whig Party, in a way, kind of got like the rich people that were of the Democratic Republicans and the wealthier of New England, and they kind of coalesced into the Whig Party. And the gradual territorial expansion was actually an idea of Thomas Jefferson, because he wanted that yeoman farmer. And to get that, you have to have that gradual expansion, and they make a farm and they make it work. This was highly favored in the North. And if you look at the Northwest Territory that we're going to talk about later, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, they are going to be free states, not slave states. Expansion is a major theme of this time period. 1776, the western border of the United States is the Ohio River. We had laid claim to what is the Northwest Territory, but the British didn't exactly agree with us. Of course, they didn't agree with us at all. That's why we fought a war with them, obviously. But by the Treaty of Paris in 1783, we had officially gained the Northwest Territory. Again, that is the area between the Ohio River and the Mississippi River up north up to the Great Lakes. Later on, we're going to make a purchase called the Louisiana Purchase. We will purchase it off of France for $15 million, and Thomas Jefferson is going to have the American government sponsor a trip across the Missouri River and then down the Columbia River to the Pacific Ocean to explore the continent. And the Louisiana Purchase is going to basically double the size of the United States. I mean, the Northwest Territory kind of did it, and then the Louisiana Purchase doubled it again. So it's significantly bigger. And one of the themes that's often lost, even though I don't understand why, is the Adams-Onis Treaty. Simply put, Florida was part of Spain. It was a Spanish colony. We were able to garner that from the Spanish in the Adams-Onis Treaty. During this time period, our country will expand from 13 to 26 states. In the Northwest Territory, you will have Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio become states. In the Louisiana Territory, you're going to have Louisiana become a state. In the western South, you're going to have Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Missouri, Arkansas. Actually, Missouri was part of the Louisiana Purchase. I owe you an apology on that one. And then we're going to have a state form out of another state. Maine used to be part of Massachusetts. It was part of the state of Massachusetts, and Maine was allowed to become a state when the Massachusetts legislature said they could become their own state, and that happened in 1820. And then we had an independent country become a state of the United States. A lot of people don't know this. Vermont. Vermont declared independence from Great Britain in 1777, and they were not of the 13 original colonies, but they fought in the American Revolution with us. Officially, they were their own country until 1791, and Vermont was added as the 14th state at that time period. Kind of interesting. But that's going to be a major theme throughout this time period. We're fighting wars with Native Americans, and you have the Northwest Indian War, you have the Cherokee American Wars, you have the Creek War, which kind of gets caught up into the War of 1812 as well, and Andrew Jackson is going to be fighting the Creeks and the Cherokee, and this is going to spill over a generation later into his presidency. By the end of this time period, you have the passage pushed through by Andrew Jackson of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. And this is going to lead to the infamous Trail of Tears, where Native Americans in the Southeast were forced to leave their homes in the winter and trek from Georgia and Florida all the way to modern day Oklahoma, which at that time was called, quote unquote, Indian Territory. That was the actual name, or I wouldn't say it that way. But it was one of the biggest blights upon U.S. history towards the Native Americans. Talking about blights, another big blight on our country was slavery. Slavery, the natural growth means that it's by birth. And the natural growth rate of enslaved people in the United States was faster than any country in Europe. And they were encouraged to have lots of children. And the reason was because this was seen as a way to gain wealth. It's kind of disgusting to say it that way, but that was the mindset of Southern plantation owners. The plantation system was basically, each plantation was its own village farm almost, and everybody on the plantation was to do their job, and then the slave owner, if he was profitable, would then trickle down and funnel down his, allowing his slaves to stay there. Slaves had no rights at all, none. Their families could be broken up. They could be sold and made to go different directions. Often children would grow up and never know who their father was. This was common. The main crop which caused the growth of slavery was cotton. There were other crops, indigo, rice, and tobacco. Tobacco was a good solid number 2. But by this time period, it's not tobacco which is making slavery grow. It's definitely cotton. Northern states abolished slavery, but it's slower than you think. In the late 1700s, a lot of northern states still had slavery. For example, New York did. New York didn't abolish slavery until July 4th, 1827. That's a northern state. But Pennsylvania would be the first state to abolish slavery. That would be in 1780. That's after that's while our country is fighting in the Revolutionary War. So Pennsylvania, here in 1776, we have this statement in our Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, endowed with certain inalienable rights, and yet we have slaves. That is something that our young nation is going to have to deal with. And it's hard to look in the mirror and see quote unquote your warts and your blemishes and fix them. It's a hard thing to do, and it's something our country has had to fight its entire time. We also had the growth, though, of the abolition movement. And it's really important to point out that the abolitionist movement, by the way, abolition is the doing away with slavery. Slavery, illegal. Abolish it. Abolition. One of the big reasons the abolitionist movement happened does have to do with religion. So we have to at least mention this. You have in the Western frontier Baptist and Methodist preachers going from place to place, and they would have what was called a circuit. Now this circuit, they would literally have church every place along their route, and then they would repeat this route over and over and over again. So it's hard to envision this, but in some places on the frontier, the churches would meet on Sunday, but the preacher may not be preaching on Sunday. It might be that they just have a prayer meeting in the rural frontier. Maybe the preacher can't be there till Tuesday. So they would have church on Sunday and Tuesday, or maybe the preacher can't be there until Wednesday. So they would have church on Sunday and Wednesday. And if you pay attention to churches around here now, even, don't we have a church meeting sometime in some of these churches in the middle of the week? That tradition started with the circuit riders because the preacher couldn't be there until a certain day. And by the way, on that certain day, that was the day you could get married. So I'd like to get married on a Thursday and with the trees and then, well, the preacher's not going to be here till Monday, so you're going to get married on a Monday. That literally was the way it was. But the other thing that they did, these circuit preachers spoke often about the Exodus. They preach from the book of Exodus a lot. And if you know anything about the book of Exodus at all, and if you don't, just listen, I'll tell you. The book of Exodus is about the Jewish people gaining their freedom from the Egyptian slave owners and God taking care of them and the 10 plagues and that whole story of Moses and Pharaoh, let my people go, and he says no. And okay, this is going to feed in, and there's a revival happening in the United States, especially in the Western frontier, during this time period. It's called the Second Great Awakening. And these people with religious fervor are going to begin to fight against slavery. They're going to create groups like the American Colonization Society, which literally started a colony in Africa that became an independent country called Liberia. Its capital is Monrovia, named after James Monroe. You're going to have the American Anti-Slavery Party. You're going to have the Liberty Party, the American Missionary Association. Missionary, they're people who preach to people around the world, missionaries. So you can see the religious aspect there. You're also going to have Article 1 of Section 9 of the Constitution, which says that new slaves cannot be shipped into the United States. Now, that did not end slavery. In fact, slavery was continuing to grow. We already talked about that. But what it did do was it made it illegal to bring slaves into the United States from outside the United States. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. In fact, it did. The main way that they did it was they smuggled slaves in through Spanish Florida until Spanish Florida became an American colony, American territory, and then they still found ways to smuggle slaves in. So, enforcement is, 9/10 of the law. Remember that. And you did have pro-slavery movement attacks. The most famous one is Elijah Paris Lovejoy. He was murdered for printing an abolitionist newspaper in Illinois. You also had something called the Farron Riots in New York City, and you had the New Haven excitement. New Haven's in Connecticut, folks. So Connecticut is often seen as an anti-slavery state, and it was. But, then somebody in New Haven wanted to establish an African-American college to educate African-Americans who were former slaves. Well, we don't believe in slavery, but you don't want to educate those people. That was the mindset, and it literally created a riot in New Haven, Connecticut. So attitudes had to change. All right, you're going to have economic issues, and one of the big issues here is we are expanding so fast that we are land rich, but cash and specie poor. First off, specie is gold and silver. Bullion is all precious metals, which includes copper, okay? It can include platinum today, or any precious, titanium, that's a precious metal. That's bullion. Specie is specifically gold and silver, those two metals. Our country early on didn't have enough money. So here we have former Revolutionary War veterans, and we owe them money, and we don't have money. and it literally caused a rebellion up in Massachusetts called Shays' Rebellion, where basically the state of Massachusetts was within a stone's throw of getting taken over by a mob of former Revolutionary War veterans led by a man named Daniel Shay. And because their farms were being taken away from them because they had fought in the war and they had taken loans out so they could fight in the war. And this new United States said we'd pay them, and then we couldn't pay them, and they were getting their farms foreclosed. They were literally going broke because they had fought for this new country, and they were getting angry, rightfully so. So what our government did was they offered land in the Northwest Territory. And this is why you have a whole bunch of Revolutionary War veterans in Washington County, Ohio. We talked about that in an earlier lesson. They're there because we didn't have cash, but we had a whole bunch of land. And these people who wanted paid, they wanted paid so they could have farms. And we were like, okay, so we don't have enough money to pay for your 2-acre farm here, but we have like 500 acres over there in Washington County. Why don't you go take those acres of land, 50, 500, whatever it might be, and if you're willing to move there, we'll give you all that land. It's better farmland, and the only thing is you just say we're even. Well, to a farmer, for a lot of farmers, that sounds like a good deal, and that's why they came here. Our government did not have economic safety nets set up. Again, we didn't even really have a national bank set up yet. So when economic problems happened, Americans really suffered. And you have, in this time period, 1, 2, 3, 4 depressions or panics caused for various reasons. The 1796, the Bank of England was trying to get their money back. That led to Shays' Rebellion. The Depression of 1807 because of the Embargo Act of 1807. Depression of 1815 through 1821 because we had just finished the War of 1812 and now people, were not spending as much. And the Panic of 1837, and that literally was caused because Andrew Jackson would only take specie for land in the West to be sold. The problem was there wasn't enough gold and silver to do it. So it literally just created this panic. But you're going to see this theme repeat itself over and over and over again in our fledgling country. New countries, that's one of the biggest problems they have. If you look at new countries today, it's economic. Their biggest problem is economic. How do they handle inflation? That's money losing its value. If it's rapid inflation, that means it's happening really fast. Or deflation. Like, for example, by the time we get to 1837, deflation is the major problem. What's deflation? That's money gaining value too fast so that nobody wants to spend it. Think about it. If a dollar is worth $1.20 in a month, and $1.50 in 3 months, and $1.80 in a year, you're not going to want to spend that dollar. You're like, I'm holding on to it. Well, the problem is if nobody's spending money, then nothing is getting made. And it literally causes problems. All right, the other themes are, and I put them together because during this time period, one is causing the other. Industrialization and sectionalism. In the North, you're going to begin to have factories come out. And the main product that's going to cause factories to be built during this time period are textiles. Textiles are the making of cloth. And you're going to have textile mills begin to develop along the fall line on all these small New England rivers. Remember when we did the map of New England? There were a whole bunch of rivers, okay? Each of those rivers have a waterfall. The first waterfall, you come from the ocean upstream and you hit that waterfall, that's the water line. And that waterfall was especially valuable property because that waterfall could turn a water wheel, and that water wheel would form the power for either the saws and the sawmill for the wood, or for the cotton to be spun into fabric in the textile mill. A lot of times the sawmill and the textile mill were like right next to each other, or they were literally in the same factory. And the factories had to be at the waterfall. The thing that's going to make that change is steam power and the steam engine. The steam engine is going to allow for coal burning factories to exist. It's going to allow the factories to move to the cities where people are actually living. And so now all of a sudden cities are going to grow exponentially because people move to the city to get jobs. These factories can also go anywhere where a boat can go because of the steamboat, which was invented by Robert Fulton. And railways are going to allow people to go past the fall line and actually get materials such as coal, which you need for steam engines. So like the B&O Railroad opens in 1830. All this is happening very fast, but all this is happening in the north. Okay, what's happening in the south? Well, you have the factory system in the north, and they need raw cotton. I mean, if you're going to make cloth, you need the raw material. And so in the South, they have the slave labor, and they're able to produce a very cheap raw cotton because they don't have to pay their workers. They own their workers. One of the most tedious jobs was getting the seeds out of the raw cotton. An invention called the cotton engine, or the short version is cotton gin. Gin is a nickname. The cotton gin revolutionized cotton work, and it was able to quickly get the seeds out of raw cotton to make it shippable towards northern industrial plants that were along the Atlantic Ocean. So you had this trade between the South and the North, and the plantation system, which some people argue may have been in a decline until the Industrial Revolution got here, ramps up. And of course, by 1860, you're going to have over 4 million slaves in the South. Northern demand for cheap raw cotton enforced the justification of the slave system. All right, now these are all the major themes. I know I took quite a bit of time, but honestly, it's a lot quicker. And I did not touch on everything. So if what you wanted talked about didn't show up, it's not because I'm ignoring you. It was because this is a lot. But I hope this helps, and you guys have a wonderful day.